Coming up on this week's show, Mario Maker comes to the N64.
Exciting news for point-and-click adventure fans.
And we get some inside stories from Codemasters and Bullfrog with Mark Healey.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each and every week with our brilliant friends at Bitmap Books. Now, have you seen their latest volume, N64, a visual compendium, telling the story of the console that changed the gaming world and covering over 150 titles that defined the Nintendo 64. We'll tell you more about that in just a bit, but you can check it out and the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. And with our lovely mates at PCB Way. Now, if you're working on anything retro over the summer and maybe you need a custom PCB prototyping service, low cost, fast turnaround quality boards, they've got you covered. And they do services like 3D printing and injection molding. And of course, you know that PCB Way, huge supporters of the retro community, so you can get an instant quote on their website right now at pcbway.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 430. Your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to the show. Of course, a podcast that every single week takes you on a nostalgic trip back to the golden age of video games, brings you up to speed on all the big happenings in the world of retro from over the last 7 days, and brings you veterans of the industry onto the podcast every week to tell us their story. And we've got an amazing guest who worked for some of the biggest gaming companies back in the day to talk to this week. We'll tell you more about him in just a moment. But before we do that, of course, summer in full swing. Even had a little bit of sunshine here in the UK for the last couple of days. Not to jinx things too much.
Rain,
yeah, lots of rain coming over the next week, I think. But that does mean that we're getting literally just days away from some of these huge events. I think we're about, 30 days away from one of the biggest events that's going to be happening in the UK. Kickstart is coming up, your huge Amiga show at the end of next month.
Yeah, it's coming up, and tickets are selling fast. I think probably have about 20 tickets left.
Wow.
For Saturday. And that's going to be absolutely ramo as well. And the after party, we're hitting about 200 already for that. So that's going to be a lot busier than last time. And if you don't know what it is, it's a UK Amiga show. Can you believe it? And it's on the 29th to the 30th of June in Nottingham. We're going to be having some amazing speakers there as well. Tony Warrener, Stu Cambridge, DJ Hoffman's going to be there as well. And he's going to be performing at that after party alongside Pete Cannon, our friend from Rare as well, David Wise, and many other artists. There's going to be loads of traders. Interestingly, we just had some traders coming from Poland and France as well. So nice. Starting to get some of the international traders there. So check it out at amigashow.com. I'm really excited about this, and it gets scarier and scarier as it gets closer and closer. But I've been having a lot of meetings with people and stuff, and I think it's going to be bigger than ever, this one.
I was going to say, you sound a bit calmer than you did this time last year. Do you think 'cause you've done one before, it's a bit like you kind of know what you're doing now?
Yeah. I've kind of broken the seal on it, but also I'm embracing delegation this year. So, getting a lot more people involved because it's scaled up a lot.
Yeah, so this is Ravi's massive Amiga event happening at the end of next month in Nottingham. Joe and I will be there as well. I think Joe's going to be selling a load of his stuff off on your
Mega Drives.
Yeah, that's it. Might be some Amiga stuff there if I manage to clean out my cupboard in time. Might even have a few copies of our book for sale there as well. We often get people asking about that. So if you want to get your tickets for that, and like you said, that massive after party as well, that's going to be happening at the Saltbox Bar in the middle of Nottingham. So that's going to be going on till the early hours on Saturday night. So if you'd like to join us for that, great weekend of Amigas and bit of drinking as well, I'm sure. That's coming up, Kickstart 02. Tickets for that, amigashow.com. And then in August, you and I, Ravi, heading out to Norway, to Sandefjord for Retro Messer's 10th anniversary. We love this show, don't we?
Oh, yeah. Norwegian show is just amazing, and everybody speaks perfect English as well. It's absolutely
we're so lazy when we go abroad, aren't we? We're like really are spoiled.
Well, I'll tell you, Kev Bayliss is coming along, and he's actually been learning Norwegian for a couple of years now.
Kev Bayliss from Rare, yeah.
Yeah, so he's absolutely in there. I don't know if he's going to be doing his panel in Norwegian as well, but this is retromessa.no is a website, and it's on the 17th and 18th of August. And, it's great because we have a lot of Scandinavian listeners that come over and see us there and have a chat. And, like, just the vibe of that show is just fantastic. And, seeing what the crew's done there and created this absolutely amazing show over 10 years is bonkers. And the guests that they get as well.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which we're working on at the moment. Still, talks are still ongoing. But I'm sure we're going to have some amazing panels that you and I will be hosting up there on the stage at Retro Messe. And of course, they have that massive traders area there as well. It's always such a lovely crowd, isn't it, when you come out to Norway? So if you can make it, if you're in that area, or even like we said before, it's only like a couple of hour flight from the UK, not far at all. So if you want to come over, happening on the 17th and 18th of August at Sandefjord in Norway, Retro Messe's 10th anniversary. Tickets for all these events we will link up in the show notes as well. Now, we did mention that we have got an amazing guest on the podcast this week. I think we've been on a bit of a roll with guests recently. I mean, I love every guest that we've had on this show, but we've had some massive names on over the last couple of months. And that continues today, as we're going to be talking to a bit of a Bullfrog legend. Mark Healey is going to be joining us on the podcast this week.
I love Bullfrog. I think it's one of the coolest companies. Just so many of their titles were massively successful, and it's great to get Mark on as well because Mark was doing art at Bullfrog, and he was involved with a lot of these huge franchises. He actually did Theme Park on the SNES and on the Mega Drive as well, which is really interesting because it has quite a unique look compared to the Amiga version and PC version as well, a total different look. And we kind of hear about his story, his history of how he got into video games, but also working through other companies like Codemasters as well. And
I know that really, obviously Mark worked on huge games. You mentioned Theme Park. He worked on Magic Carpet as well. But really, I think the thing you were most excited to talk to him about was Fun School.
I love Fun School. Fun School is crazy. 650,000.
Explain what Fun School was for people that don't remember.
Fun School was like a Europress kind of game that was created as edutainment. It was actually one of my first gaming experience. My dad was like, right, I'm getting you a computer game, and I was like, oh, this is going to be some killer kind of game, really violent. And then he was like, it's Fun School. So great.
Click on the frog and make it talk.
But I absolutely loved it. It was fun, interactive stuff, and
it was Fun School.
It's Fun School.
Yeah. So it's interesting to hear about that. So I remember getting a demo of that on a magazine cover disc. And I thought as edutainment goes, it was very good. And I think you found out it sold over like 1 million copies in the end, that series.
Yeah. By the end, I think it's 1.5 million, which is absolutely mental. And, Mark also worked on Dungeon Keeper as well, which is an absolutely huge game of black and white as well. Ragdoll Kung Fu, and Little Big Planet as well. So absolutely extensive, fantastic career.
Yeah, and actually he's gone back into a Commodore 64 development over the last couple of years as well. So we hear about that.
Loops around to the beginning, yeah.
It really does. He's such an interesting guy. So we're going to be hearing from Mark Healey, stories of Codemasters, Bullfrog, Lionhead, lots more as well. He's coming up on the show in around half an hour from now. Before that though, boys, you ready for some news?
Absolutely. Always.
In another busy week. Oh, well, it does feel like, we were saying this last week, Joe, that it feels like the N64 scene, we just can't cover all the news. It's so vibrant right now.
I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just the websites I go to, the forums I'm in, the pages I follow. But there has been so much going on with the N64 at the moment. Obviously, the tool last week, the decompiling tool last week, which is absolutely amazing. But this has blown my mind as well this week. This is Mario Builder 64. So to set the scene, obviously there was Mario Maker for the Wii U and then Mario Maker 2 for the Switch.
Yeah.
Which, I really enjoyed those games. I enjoyed more making the levels than, with my wife and just having a laugh. Like one of us would hide out in the other room while the other made the level, and then we'd come in and play it.
Did you make them brutal as well? Like put some nasty surprises in there?
We would try to. And obviously you make your own Mario levels on there based on the original like NES Mario's and Super Mario World.
It was all 2D, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it was all 2D, and then the all new Super Mario was like the Wii versions and stuff. And, in my mind, I do remember thinking at the time, like, wouldn't it be amazing if you could do the N64 graphics or Mario Sunshine, even if it was, just side-along 2D. And, that hasn't been made. So these modders, these hackers, have made it for us with Mario Builder 64. So this is another toolbox that kind of lets you fulfill that dream.
And we'd covered this before as like a proof of concept, I think, but now it's the actual like release.
The actual tool, the actual release. Yes, it's been developed by Rovertronic and Arthur Tilley. And what's really cool about this, so it looks fantastic. Like it's Mario 64, it's all the assets and sprites and graphics from Mario 64, and they've made it really simple, so you can just kind of like pick up and play it and just start making your own Mario 64 levels within, like the kind of the map. And I can't describe how awesome this is. Like, it's literally got all the different levels from Mario 64. So if you want the water level, the snow level, Princess Peach's castle, the lava levels, the desert levels, you literally just flick through what level you want. And then you can put all the assets in there. You can put Bowser in there. You can put the bombs in there. The world is your oyster, and you can make it as simple or as advanced as you want. And what I find really interesting about this ROM is all you do is you patch a copy of the original game with this hack that you download, and then you just play it within the ROM. And you can play it on emulation, or you can actually play it on original hardware, it says. I'm not too sure how that works.
Yeah, you need an EverDrive to do that.
Fair enough, but I'm not too, I guess, would you do that on the actual N64 controller?
Yeah, I think you'd do it, or just as you're playing an N64 game, but you'd patch the ROM basically before and then load the ROM up in the EverDrive. And I think the way that they've done this is they've done it to avoid legal problems, because they could say, like, we're just using the assets that are already in the game. We're not providing any. We're just putting it in a new format, or we're like coding it so it works in a different way. Because I'm sure Nintendo will be like, what?
Well, anything you do like this with Nintendo assets, obviously you've got to be very, very careful about that, haven't you? To make sure there's none of Nintendo's assets in there. And it looks like there have been. I mean, as we always say, it's not always a guarantee. Nintendo's lawyers can be a little bit vigilant, shall we say. But yeah, I mean, it looks really straightforward. I mean, the setting it up is basically the bit that takes a little bit of work, but you basically need the patcher, then you need the original Super Mario 64 ROM. Obviously, they haven't linked that up anywhere. Play a backup of your original, they do say. And then you need an emulator that supports virtual SD card emulation. So they're saying there is one available at the moment called a Parallel Launcher. And if you want to play an original hardware, you'll need, again, an EverDrive or a flash card that supports SD cards. So stuff like the 64 drive or the EverDrive 64 or the Summer Kart 64 as well. And then basically you just patch your original ROM and then load it up as if it was a game and, go ahead and make your own levels.
I can imagine there's going to be some limits in here. So there's not going to be like, you can put 1,000 sprites and like, you can't fill the whole space with it and do it infinitely huge map. They might have like, right, you can do this many in this amount of space just because of the hardware,
From what I can see, the maps are only as big as the original Mario 64 maps were.
Yeah.
So like kind of contained in that big circular space, but they have like 10 stories to them. So like 10 levels, because obviously a lot of the Mario 64 levels were essentially a floating island. If you were to kind of get the camera and zoom out, you couldn't do that in the game, but like in mods and stuff like that. And it's the same concept, and you pick what level you're building on, and if you want to build land or water or sand, etc. But it does seem strange that Nintendo haven't already done this.
Yeah, like a 3D version of Mario Maker.
Yeah, like for two modders to have done this and done such a fantastic job of it, just using old assets. And I love the menus where they've drawn like the Goombas and the stars and stuff like themselves. I think that looks fantastic.
Could it be applied to other games, so like GoldenEye Maker or something like that. That would be really cool.
I couldn't see why not.
Mario Kart Maker would be good. Imagine making your own circuits.
Yeah, I can't see why they couldn't do that, to be honest. That's a good idea there, Ravi.
Bubsy Maker.
Bubsy 3D Maker. I'm all right.
One thing I love about this as well, though, is like the original Mario Makers, you can actually play the levels that other people have made.
Yep.
So they're hosting these online. There's a couple of places you can go. There's a Discord server where you can download them from, or a place called Level Share Square. It's basically like a homebrew community of different, Mario Builder communities where you can download. They're called MB64 files. So basically you can download that and, put it on your SD card or load it in your emulator and access levels that other people have made, which I think that, to me, when I was playing Mario Maker, that was one of the main things I did. Weirdly, I made a few maps of my own, but mainly it was just playing other people's in the community.
Yeah, mine were never as good as some of those crazy community maps. And, oh, God, the difficulty level was really high on some of them.
Yeah, so lots of fun. And basically, if you've been playing Mario 64 for like 25 odd years, it kind of breathes new life into the game as well, which I think is very cool. So that is available now. If you want to check that out, I will link that in this week's show notes.
Thank you for VectorFunk on Discord, Eamon, for providing that.
Yeah, we do have a little section in our Discord, which I think you can join via our new website. Is the button back on there now?
Yes, Discord's at the bottom. Yeah,
nice. Yeah, we do have a little redesign to our website this week, thanks to Ravi. So if you want to join our Discord community, there is a link on there. Click through, and we do have a section for news. So if you spot anything during the week and you think, the lads might want to talk about that, pop it in there. We'd appreciate that. As did Beast British. He submitted this story into our Discord, and I'm very pleased that he did, because this completely passed me by, but it turns out this is something that is so up my street. It is ridiculous. Now, this is a new game that's coming out. They're saying the Kickstarter is going to launch later this year, and they're hoping it's going to have a 2025 release. This is called Cronila's Mansion. Now, this is a spiritual successor to Maniac Mansion. And how good does this look?
I love the vibes of this, like real 80s, like tech noir horror vibes, and kind of like also like an anime style to the clips.
Yeah.
The trailer launched this week. As you said, the Kickstarter hasn't launched yet, just says later summer 2024. But yeah, man, this looks absolutely fantastic. This is being developed by Stranus, I think you say it, who are a Spanish developer. The music in the trailer as well sounds absolutely fantastic. So I really, really hope that is in the game. But yeah, it's based on, like you say, popular Scum system, like Maniac Mansion, etc. I'm terrible at these games, but this might draw me in to back and play. I'm not too sure what the storyline is. Maybe very similar to Maniac Mansion, kind of haunted mansion horror.
Yeah, it looks like that, doesn't
it? Yeah, looks like there's a killer going around with like a ram skull mask on, murdering people. And you play as like a cool looking, maybe teenaged kind of leather jacket looking guy.
But a Teen Wolf kind of vibe going on there.
Yeah, Teen Wolf kind of vibe kind of going on. Yeah,
it looks very much like Maniac Mansion, even though that wasn't a title that I played that much, so I'm not that nostalgic for it. I understand its importance, script utility for Maniac Mansion, and its roots. But it's something that I played point and clicks a lot later on than that. Did you play much Maniac Mansion?
No, I think Monkey Island was the first kind of one that I really got into, point and click adventures. Again, that kind of feels like we did a podcast a while ago, didn't we? Of kind of gaps in our gaming history. It does kind of feel like I should play Maniac Mansion through.
Maybe we should do that. Yeah, that would be good, because it is classic, and maybe this could be like a modern take on it, and we could check that out as well.
Well, it does feel like that genre's had which I'm very pleased about, because I did love point and click adventures. Pretty much anything after Monkey Island. I love Loom back in the day. Monkey Island 2, played that. Simon the Sorcerer, Curse of Enchantia, all of those games.
I loved Thimbleweed Park as well, which was another one. Yeah.
Yeah, Ron Gilbert did in recent years, didn't he? Thimbleweed Park, the guy that made Monkey Island. And of course, we had Return to Monkey Island as well a couple of years ago. So this kind of feel like, point and clicks are kind of making a bit of a comeback recently as well. So the interesting thing about this is that they're going to be releasing this on a load of different systems as well. Apparently, there's going to be a version for the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, the Switch, the PC. And then if you click on the trailer, like you said, it only launched about a week ago. There's not so many comments on it yet. But the top comment on there, someone said, it's interesting to see how many platforms this will be distributed on. It would be nice to see this on the Amiga as well. And they've replied saying that they've got several pending systems, MS-DOS, Commodore 64, even Sega, but the Amiga will be one of the first that we try. So it sounds like it could be on even more systems, maybe Mega Drive, Amiga 500. So,
I guess, if it's kind of built on that basis of that engine, it might be easy to port. Apart from the FMVs, you know.
Yeah, I'm assuming they will do, like, for the Kickstarter, the first tier, if they're successful, would be PC and Switch, by the looks of things, and then it will be after that, you know, Super Nintendo and Game Boy Advance. I can't imagine they're too massively different, and then it'd be, you know, NES and Game Boy perhaps afterwards.
Hopefully stretch goals to kind of get it on those.
Yeah, I imagine there'll be stretch goals, but then it might be interesting to see, if they then do an Amiga version and a Mega Drive version and stuff like that. But yeah, this looks wicked. I'm really looking forward to the launch of this.
Yeah, so I'm going to check out the trailer. Like we said, Kickstarter, no date yet on when it's going to be launching, but obviously it's something we'll be keeping an eye on. So if you want to get hyped for it like we are, I'll link up the trailer in this week's show notes as well. Now, talking of exciting new games, and this one really stepping up the horror. This looks right up your street, this one, Joe. This is a game called The Glass Staircase.
So this is a game that was released on Steam in 2019, and it's now being ported to Switch, Xbox, and PlayStation. And this comes from Puppet Combo, who I've mentioned before on the show. And they are a indie developer who is actually a one-man army, Ben Kakuza, who is a huge fan of Italian 80s horror films, like slasher films, like Zombie, and I'm trying to think of some other ones right now, but, you know, in that kind of vein. And he's made quite a lot of games, just to, you know, kind of name a few, kind of get you the idea, but like Meat Cleaver Mutilation, Nun Massacre, etc. Very, very, very over-the-top 80s style horror games, but they play mostly kind of like classic PS1 style first-person horror games, or in this case, survival horror Resident Evil / kind of Silent Hill games. And this is getting ported on the 24th of May, so it'll be out now. What's interesting about these games, which might be good for you, Dan, is they're usually about £10 and they're only about an hour and a half long, because it's kind of like a film you would play. So very
You don't need hours then to think into
them. You don't need hours and hours and hours to put into them. They are scary games. They tend to be. And
not for Ravi then.
Looks just as scary.
Just looking at this trailer, I was just like, no.
Just as scary and atmospheric as usual. But by the looks of this, in this one, you play as a young lady who is exploring an abandoned mansion, which is full of creepy crawlies, monsters, zombies, etc. And you're trying to uncover a mystery, as you usually are in these kind of games. But the style is definitely that kind of early PS2 style in this one, very reminiscent of Silent Hill 2, foggy, rainy, scary, running around with your double barrel shotgun and your rifle, item management, solving puzzles. So absolutely right up my street, and anybody who's into those kind of early survival horror games, you know, mid to late 90s, early 2000s ones, definitely go check this out and some of the other works by Puppet Combo. But get them while you can, because sometimes they get taken down from Xbox.
Right. They've been too gory.
A bit too gory.
Xbox can't handle it.
Yeah.
You know what? Those PS2 style graphics, I think they make it creepier, if anything.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
100%.
Yeah, definitely.
100%. Like, I usually play these with my wife, and she says it's hilarious watching me play games like this, because I'm literally like, ooh.
Yeah.
Sat there playing it.
Yeah, so it looks loads of fun. That, like you said, available today at the time this episode comes out on Friday 24th. So I will link that up if you want to check it out in this week's show notes too, like all the rest of the stories. Now, we're going to be chatting to Mark Healey, our special guest, in just a moment. Before we do that, should we just take a quick second to welcome in some new patrons who joined us this week? Because, of course, we do have a patron that does support this podcast. And we've had this for about, 3 or 4 years now? And it's made such a big difference to this show and the community. I mean, not just financially, obviously it helps us keep the lights on, but the community that we've built up around this podcast, I think, is just really special.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even to a point where I've now made, like what I'd like to say, close friends, people messaging me today about stuff they've seen from across the world and just having a general chat about like how we are and stuff like that. And, just to know that these people, it all came from just listening to our podcast and then just, supporting us and stuff like that. It is the community that's come out of it. And I'm not going to sit here and say it's a community that us three have built. It's a community that the backers and the fans have built.
Yeah.
And then we're just a part of that, if that makes sense. I just absolutely love it.
Yeah, and we're going to be doing our monthly patrons hangout this coming Sunday evening. So we do that last Sunday of the month. So that's going to be happening 8 p.m. This Sunday, UK time, for a couple of hours. So we just basically all get together, massive Zoom call. We all just geek out, loads of fun, very chilled out. Some of us have a few drinks. If you'd like to join us for that. If you've heard us talking about it before and you're thinking, I've always fancied joining one of those, if you join our Patreon now, you'll get a link to that. All patrons are welcome this coming Sunday evening. Also, we do a bonus podcast called The Retro Hour After Hours, of which the latest episode is our top 5 tech-related movies.
Yeah, I love doing that episode. And also just want to point out that there's a free episode that you can listen to. If you want to hear an example of it, just go to the website and click at the top and it'll say bonus after hours episode. And that's about Amiga games we still play as well. So you can listen to the full episode there. And then how many extras do we have for that? I think it's
42.
Yeah, 42 as well. So yeah, if you enjoy that, then you'll enjoy these others.
Yeah, and of course, the main reason for supporting the podcast on Patreon is just to make sure that we can keep bringing it out every week. It covers all our costs and everything as well. So we hugely appreciate your support. And of course, everyone that joins us on Patreon does get a special mention in the most prestigious high score table in the world of retro gaming, and that is the Retro Hour Hall of Fame.
Hall of Fame!
And let's induct our latest members. A massive thank you to Alexander Benstang,
Nick Barron,
Simon,
and Carls, who all joined us over the last week. We massively appreciate your support, and if you'd like to join our wonderful community of patrons, all the details to sign up are at theretrohour.com. Right, then a few more news stories to chat about before we hop into our interview with Mark Healey. And Tetris is something else that's been making the headlines over the last year or so quite a lot. Obviously, we got the Tetris docudrama that I know we all enjoyed. And then we have the stories about, all these kids that are breaking world records on Tetris as well. We've had, reboots of Tetris, like Tetris 99 on the Switch. Tetris, it just seems to be the game that is unstoppable. And I love seeing it when people actually do hack classic versions of Tetris to do previously unheard of things on them.
Yeah,
like this on the NES Tetris.
I know why you saved this story to later in this show, because it is so complex.
It is quite a technical one, so that's why we're going to sit back and let Ravi explain it. Yeah.
I'm going to try and decipher it for you guys. So it's the NES version of Tetris, and as you said, a player hit that kill screen, and it was like international news. It took 34 years to actually get to that. But since that's happened, a lot of people have done it and kind of recreated it. It's like once one thing happens and suddenly it becomes easy. It's, quite strange. But what people have been doing now is they've kind of hit that kill screen and they've realized that they can manipulate the memory and add some codes into Tetris that basically enable it to, it would roll over, but it would crash sometimes.
I think it got to level 150 and it generally started to fall apart, didn't it? Because it couldn't keep up with the speed.
Yeah, and, it would be trying to read memory from different places, and it would read memory from the RAM, and there was a lot of, garbage in the RAM, garbage code that was put in there, and that would cause it to crash. Well, amazingly, using the Famicom, there's an extra port in there. Joe probably knows about this. There's an expansion port, which is used for other controllers, as the Famicom has the controllers actually built in. Yeah. So they've worked out now, using that other controller, you can do sequences, and that will then put some code into the RAM.
Can I explain what you have to do as well?
Yeah, you can explain the sequence.
Well, this is, so basically you've got the two hardwired controllers, and then you have a third and fourth controller plugged into the external controller ports, and apparently you've got to hold up on the third controller and right, left, and down on the fourth controller. So you've got to do all that at the same time.
Yes.
While fiddling with the left and right on the directional input as well, apparently.
But then that doesn't have enough space to add the bare metal code in, basically. So what you're doing is you're then going into the scoreboard and you're enabling it to have more code, more symbols and combinations in there by basically doing a bit of kind of code injecting into the board by typing, brackets and commas and stuff like this, which then opens up the RAM to accept even more code. So then you can kind of start hacking it further. It's quite complicated, but basically you're modifying the game to make it, in this instance, crash less, but there may be more things that you can do in future. Now, my thinking of this is somebody's going to get like a Raspberry Pi that you could just hook up to that port and just blast a load of code at it. Yeah. That's going to do it all in one, and this will probably be used in like competitions, or if people want to just continually playing forever and ever and ever and see how far they get, or increase it to some kind of mad level. Because at the moment they've been able to stop it crashing, but there's a lot of kind of things that they could do possibly in future.
So the upside of this is once you've done that, the game doesn't crash anymore, and you can continue playing it longer than was previously playable before it crashed at level 150. But I mean, you did mention there about competitions, and that was one thing I was wondering. So I thought, well, how's that going to change competitive Tetris? And would it even be allowed, or would that technically be thought of as like because I know cheats are not normally allowed in like competitive.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if they have it on the original NES as well, and they're like, right, you can only use this, and someone turns up with a Famicom and they're like, no, you've got to stick to the same hardware. I'm not quite sure. It's very interesting, though. To me, it's like when people used to do like SQL or PHP injections and stuff and put code into places it shouldn't be. And also stuff like, you always have these exploits like in the Toy Story, I think it was the Game Boy game, or the PlayStation games as well, where you're kind of creating another mode or something. I always love these kind of weird hack stories, but this one's definitely complicated.
I still know how the hell someone figured this out.
Yeah, that's it. And if any game, it's going to be Tetris, isn't it? That people look into this deeply.
Yeah, there's some genius hackers who are wasting all their talents on Tetris, but probably for the best. So, very impressive. So if you want to check that out, I'll link that up in the show notes too. And just one more story for everybody else. Patrons get a few extra ones because we do that every week on the show. But for everyone else, let's talk about this. Ever fancy playing with a classic Mac, Joe?
Not really.
Because Ravi was going to buy you one.
Right.
I've got to get Joe into the cult of Mac.
Oh, okay. I mean, I can't even think of any games.
Have you even played with a modern Mac?
No.
You're Macless.
Well, if you ever fancied learning a bit about the history of the Apple operating system, which I think I played with my first Mac when I was about 7 years old at my auntie's print shop. I think I've told that story before. She used to run like a branch of Pronto Print, they were called, and they had like one of the, I think the Macs that you probably got in your room behind you, Ravi, one of the old all-in-one kind of 128K Macs.
I've got a 512K next to me, yeah.
Yeah, and it was, I remember using a mouse for it on the first time, and it's always been a machine that's been like a very user-friendly computer. I've got mostly Macs these days, and I've got, since then I've obviously used Power Macs and stuff at college and university. So, I've enjoyed the Mac operating system, but there was definitely a period of Mac OS that I missed. Well, I'd say particularly the 90s. I didn't use many Mac computers in the 90s.
It's the OS that's changed the most architectures, I think. It's gone from 68K, and then it went on to PowerPC, and then it's gone on to, it went on to Intel and 86K, and now it's gone on to ARM. So it's like had a big journey, and there's been so many different versions. And then, of course, you've had a next step as well, which was when they kicked Steve Jobs out, and then the next OS was kind of built, and then that went into what was OS X. So it's got a huge history of operating system releases, actually.
Now, there is obviously emulators that you can run if you want to run classic Mac operating systems. I remember using, I'm trying to think of one, the Amiga Shapeshifter.
Yes.
I used to run that back in the day. I might still have it installed on my Amiga 4000. But there is now, if you ever want to run these classic Mac operating systems and basically get a look of what the Mac OS was like from version 1.0, System 1.0, back in 1984, all the way up to Mac OS 9.2. So these are really all of the classic Mac versions, including, like you did mention, Next Step in there as well. Really the development of, the Mac up until Mac OS and Next Step kind of merged with Mac OS 10. There's a really simple way that is literally just point and click to get these running on this awesome website called Infinite Mac.
Yeah, it's really cool because each one has a different selection of machines. So, you're not going to own a Nextcube. It's going to be quite a hard thing to get. But if you want to run it on there, you can. And you can check all the different varieties of Mac as well. They've got the Quadras in there, the Mac 2s. I've also got the G3 period of Macs. And then you can load up a few extras. So they have stuff like the Infinite HD disk, which already has a load of software installed on there. And it works so well. I love these kind of operating systems in browsers. It's mad to think that we can do that now and just have it so quickly done. Like, one thing I absolutely love is you can add a CD-ROM from a URL, and you can probably, or you can use an ISO. So you could probably get stuff from archive.org that's all out there, old Mac software. Load it up, get Mist on there or something, and experience it, even if you haven't got the hardware.
And I think that's awesome because, like you said, it goes really up to the Power Mac G3, the blue and white model. So from the original Macs, there's a good 15 years worth of computers and operating systems that you can explore there. And having that facility to be able to insert a virtual disk or CD-ROM image from a URL, you could, have a Google Drive folder full of them, I imagine.
Have Premiere on there and then do some video editing in your browser. I doubt that's possible, but
I'm going to wait for Action Retro to make that video now.
Yeah, that's it. I edited this video in a browser.
So I we've talked before. We've done whole episodes about the Mac, and like you said, the history of gaming on the Mac. Stuff like Myst, Halo, SimCity, obviously great versions of that on the Mac back in the day. Prince of Persia, I remember that being a really good version.
Oh, yes.
On the classic Mac. It's just a really interesting and very accessible way to play around with these classic operating systems and applications without having to fork out
straight away, I've just opened it and it's got Another World, Prince of Persia, Shufflebot Cafe, SimCity 2000. So you can just play all of those, which is just awesome.
Can we wind this podcast up so I can go play? Yep. So if you want to check that out, a great little website called infinitemac.org, which I'll link in the show notes as well. Now we're going to be talking to this week's special guest, Mark Healey, stories from Codemasters, Bullfrog, Lionhead Studios, all of that coming up. For patrons, we're going to be talking about a weird new version of Castlevania that might not be what you expect. And also the latest mini console / computer, which is a bit of a weird one because every week on the podcast, we chop the adverts out for our patrons, so we don't give you a shorter podcast. Instead, you get an extra 10, 15 minutes of news. For everybody else, let's take a second to give a big thank you to this week's sponsor and our longest-running sponsor here on the Retro Hour podcast, into our 6th year now working with Sam and the wonderful team at Bitmap Books, and they just go from strength to strength. And I think they've timed this one very well, because we were talking a moment ago, Joe, about how active the N64 scene is right now. And if you're a fan of the Nintendo 64, this new book from Bitmap Books, N64, A Visual Compendium, I think is the ultimate love letter to that system.
Oh, man, absolutely. I grew up with the N64. It was one of our primary consoles, and I absolutely loved it. And this book really, really captures what the N64 did for the video game industry. It was one of the pioneers for 3D gaming, and just, what happened. It was the bridge kind of from that 2D to what we've got now for me. along with the PlayStation, but there were such fantastic games on the N64, and it was about 250 games there. Well, this book includes over 150 of them, so almost 2/3 of the games which were on the N64 are actually featured in this compendium as well. And every single one of them actually has an introduction as well, which is either written by an industry expert or somebody who was actually involved in the game, such as the guys from Rare, which is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and the thing about Bitmap Books is the high quality. If you haven't seen one of their books before, it's hard to describe on a podcast, isn't it? But they just leap off the page. They're gorgeous images, the highest standards of design and production. And this book is massive as well, 436 pages. Wow. Gorgeous photography. Check all the hardware and the games in all their glory. So if you love the N64, you've got to get involved in this. N64, a visual compendium. You can check it out and check out the rest of their books as well. Obviously, really helps out the podcast, supporting our sponsors. And like we said, Bitmap Books has been our longest running supporter, so we really appreciate that. You can check out their website at bitmapbooks.com. Okay, then, well, thank you for checking out the news this week. Of course, I'll have more for you on next Friday's show. Reminder, patrons hang out on Sunday. Hopefully, we'll see you there. And next, we have got an amazing guest, getting stories of companies like Codemasters, Bullfrog, talking about classic games like Magic Carpet, lots more as well, with our special guest, Mark Healey, is next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And this week, someone who has been involved in the games industry since 1988 and worked for some incredible companies, including Codemasters back in the day, the amazing Bullfrog, working on titles like Magic Carpet and Dungeon Keeper, and then went on to join Peter Molyneux at Lionhead as well, and much more, which I'm sure we'll get into over the next hour or so with our guest this week, Mark Healey. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and hello.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to hopefully do some reminiscing with us. I know we were talking before we recorded there that it was it's getting on in the years now, isn't it? It's gone scarily fast, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I do love talking about this stuff. I'm just hoping that I can actually remember something because, like I say, my brain has got a few cobwebs in there that need a bit of a cleanse, but yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Fantastic.
Hopefully we can bring some memories back, hopefully. Yeah. But I mean, let's go way back to the beginning and, start basically at day one. I mean, we always like to find out with our guests kind of what got you the bug for gaming and computers, if you like. So do you remember kind of your first gaming experience? What got you interested?
Well, yeah. So actually, this is kind of burnt into my brain, actually. I do remember the very first kind of computer game that I ever saw was at a great auntie's house who I'd never really been to before. It was this kind of big, spooky house full of scary cabinets, full of creepy dolls and things like this. And I was probably about 10 or 11 years old, I think. And they had a son who was a lot older than me. So I don't know if he was my uncle or something like that. And he basically had an Atari 2600 console sitting in the corner of the room. And the very first thing I remember was like, I saw him sitting there, in front of the television, and there was a little box under his desk that said joystick on it. And I remember thinking, that sounds a bit rude. And I sort of was like conscious of not to ask about that. I didn't really want, in case I was embarrassing. But the thing that he was playing, which might make you laugh because it's probably one of the worst games in history, was E.T.
Oh, wow.
And I was just fascinated by how he was controlling the character on the TV, and he kind of explained to me what was going on. I did try playing the game, couldn't work out what the hell was going on, but that kind of got me intrigued, really. And then my next encounter after that was actually my stepfather had brought home a console, which he'd won in a card game with his friends or something. And it was I think it was a Beanatone, however you pronounce it, this kind of weird orangey plastic thing.
Like a Pong clone thing.
Yeah, it had like variations of Pong on it that were called soccer and this kind of thing, but it also had this kind of stunt bike game where you could use the dial to control the speed of the bike and you had to jump over these buses or whatever. So that was really cool, but that only lasted a few weeks because he lost it again in gambling at cards, I think. So that was quite annoying. But then I suppose the thing that really got me properly intrigued was going to a friend's house, and he'd got a ZX81 when they first sort of came about. And I was fascinated by how he was loading the games from cassette. And I kind of assumed that the game would last as long as the cassette could play, like a music tape. Mm. And, he laughed at that, and it sort of explained to me how it was actually loading something into memory, and more importantly, how you can actually write your own programs and store them on cassette. And that really got me fascinated because I'm like, well, that means I could do that, you know. And I really started dreaming about making my own games, and just that idea that you could make things interactive and things move on the television, you know, that felt like magic to me.
Yeah.
Couldn't really stop thinking about it. So yeah, I'd say that was the thing that really got me intrigued. And then probably around that time, you know, I remember playing like Donkey Kong arcade machine my stepdad would take us to the working man's club at the weekend where they had one of those. You know, I never had enough coins to actually play it. I'd probably get one go and lose it straight away, but I used to sit there and watch other people. And yeah, I don't know, it was really fascinated by the whole phenomenon, really.
I love that kind of idea of, you know, winning a computer in a card game. And, you know, we've had so many people on the podcast that have said, oh, my dad just bought a machine that he bought in the pub home or something like that.
Oh, yeah, I was gutted when it went. It just disappeared one day and it was like, oh yeah, sorry, I lost it.
When did you get your first like serious system at home then, and what machine was it?
That was a Commodore 64. So that must have been Christmas 1984, I guess, something like that. I think I was about 14 years old, you know, and it was supposed to be a present for the family, but obviously I just completely hogged it basically. And I think the only games that I got with it were a game called Centropods by Rabbit Software, which was a sort of Centipede kind of rip-off, and another game called Armageddon by very early Ocean Software, which was essentially a missile command thing. You know, and we used to sit around in the evening with my stepdad and his mates all like competing against each other for high scores, and I just got such fond memories of that time. But you know, but what really interested me more than playing games, and still does, to be honest with you, was the idea that I could make my own games, you know, and that was a concept. And I remember at school going around telling all my mates how I was going to make a very rude version of Space Invaders just because I could, which I never actually got around to, by the way, as I couldn't actually program straight away. But yeah, I mean, I was just so hooked. And then for my birthday, which was just like a few months later, I got a copy of this thing called Learn to Code with Gore-Tex and the microchips, I think it was called. And I devoured that straight away, and I was hooked, really. And I started writing little games in BASIC just for my sisters to play. I think the first one I did was called Ghoul. I called it Ghoul Busters because I think Ghostbusters had come out. And, you know, I basically sort of did a little rip-off of just the bit where you catch the ghost sort of thing. Got my sisters to play that, and then I made a text adventure game called Agrophobia, which was really crude and rude, actually. But that was the first game that I actually duplicated some cassettes and photocopied the inlays and sold those at school to some of my mates. I sold like 3 copies, I think, for a couple of quid each.
Nice.
You know, and I just felt like a real lord. So yeah, that was a fantastic time, really. And then I think the last game that I made in BASIC around that time was a rip-off of Way of the Exploding Fist, which had come out, which was, you know, at the time was like, wow, this is amazing. So I did a game called Way of the Imploding Foot, again, written in BASIC. And it was, you know, it was then that I realized that, well, okay, I'm going to have to learn machine code, essentially, because you can't make fast arcade games in BASIC. So, yeah, I started getting into that, really. And that was when I really, really got into it.
How were you kind of learning machine code then? Were you like typing in out of magazines, or did it?
So there was a lot of, because you know, I used to get a lot of the listings, didn't you, in magazines that you could type in, but you couldn't really learn machine code from that because it was just like it was actually all like a basic listing with a couple of lines to read in the data statements, and then 1,000 lines of data statements. So they were just numbers. No, I was aware of the concept of machine code. And I was a bit naughty, actually, because there was this shop in the town called Everybody's Hobbies that sold computers and various other sort of, you know, model making, craft, things like that. And there was a book in there, I forget exactly what it was called, but it was basically learn machine code for the Commodore 64. And it was too expensive. You know, I couldn't afford to buy it. So I did the thing of like, I took a sticker of something that was much cheaper and kind of put it on the book. Right. And went up to the counter and I got it for 2 quid instead of 15 quid or something like this. And that book, I sort of went through that and I just sort of thought, wow, you know, I get it. I understand it. And I was just worked through that. And that was it, really. I mean, there was no internet back then. So obviously it was just a case of learning from there, really. And I just sort of, had a go, started making lots of little demos. I must have started about 30 different games and never finished them. You get another idea halfway through or whatever. But yeah, slowly, just through trial and error and just determination, sort of learn the basics, really. I've had to do machine code and all that.
Well, you were into art as well, and you went to art college. Were there many influences at the time that you were kind of trying to emulate?
Yeah, so I remember when I went to art college for my interview, they asked me, what are you into? What do you want to do? And I said, I love making computer games. I want to be a computer game artist, really. And they kind of politely laughed at me, really, because, it wasn't seen as a serious career back then. It was more of a cottage industry, I suppose, or at least in their eyes anyway. But, I still managed to get into the industry. And actually, I do remember them mentioning in the interview, they were like, oh, there was that guy who was here a few years ago or a year ago. He ended up doing games. And his name was Dan Malone. And he'd gone to the same art college as me. And I think he ended up doing a bunch of stuff for Palace, didn't he? Like Sacred Armour of Antiriad and all that sort of stuff. And I remember him being a really good artist on the Commodore 64 as well, actually. So I was just like, oh, that's really exciting. I'm following in the footsteps of someone amazing. So I guess you could say he was like a bit of an inspiration in that way.
Did you submit any digital art to them at all?
No. It was all just a bunch of stuff that I'd thrown together quickly to make a portfolio. One of them was probably a logo for my fledgling software company at the time. Sprite Software, I think I called myself. And probably I showed them the inlay covers from my cassette games that I'd made. But no, they were more interested. The thing that convinced them that I was worthy of going on the course was the fact that I had bought my own set of colouring pencils, these very flash ones that you could mix with water. And I think that sort of made them feel that, oh, well, he is actually into art. So yeah, let's give him a chance. Because I had to actually lie about my qualifications. You needed 4 O levels, I think it was, to get on the course, and I only had 3. So I just kind of lied about that.
Nobody checked.
Nobody checked, really. It wasn't all on computers and everything back then. They just sort of took your word for it, really. Thankfully.
Well, I did hear a story, and I'm sure you'll tell me whether it's true or not, that a Commodore disk drive was the reason that you left college.
Yeah, it literally was. So the course that I went to do was a 2-year diploma in graphic art and design, I think it was. So you're doing things like photography, typesetting, technical drawing, all this kind of stuff. And because I sort of came from a not very wealthy background, I would get a grant from the government to pay for my equipment. And the first year that was fine. I used it to buy paper and the various implements that I needed. But for the second year, I got the grant. And by this time, I'm really getting into the games. But I was doing everything off cassette, and it was really annoying, compiling games on cassette, and that was just so slow. So I just went and blew it all in one go on a disk drive for my computer. And then I left because I obviously didn't have any money to actually buy the equipment and paper and pens that I needed for the course. So, yeah, that was literally why I left. And then I got put onto a YTS scheme. I don't know if you remember those, but
oh yes, I think that helped spawn a lot of the game industry in the UK. Actually, the YTS scheme.
Yeah, I mean that was at the time we thought it was atrocious. That we was like, why can't I just go and sign on? Just let me get some money. And like, no, you've got to go and do this thing, otherwise we're not going to give you any money at all. We used to call it your Thatcher's slave. That's what I remember YTS meaning or something. But so I got put on this kind of business programming course essentially, and the thing is I was years ahead of the teacher, really. They'd give us an assignment to write like a little database or something, and it was supposed to take 2 weeks, and I would do it in a couple of hours, and I would add lots of coloured scrolling messages and all this kind of stuff. And because I'd finish it too soon, I'd start becoming quite disruptive and cause a little bit of trouble. I remember I wrote a what do they call it, the random cheek generator, which was basically sort of like a database where you could put in lots of different words and it would throw out these sort of strings of insults. And I remember printing off like sheets of it, and everyone in the class was secretly reading them and laughing out loud. So I got into quite a bit of trouble for that. But actually it ended up being really good, being on that course, because the teacher, despite the fact that I managed to annoy her a lot. She was doing some other night class or something at college, and someone that was on that class, her boyfriend was making Spectrum games for Codemasters.
Right.
And she was, she got him in basically to come and meet me. And I brought my Commodore 64 into the place where we were doing all the YTS and showed him a bunch of demos that I'd been doing. And he was impressed enough to sort of say, well, I'll put a word in for you at Codemasters. And I basically ended up driving up with him to meet David Darling a few weeks later. And I was, obviously very excited because I was like, God, I'm actually going to meet someone that's in the industry. And obviously the Darling brothers at the time seemed like the kind of proteges of the gaming industry in some ways.
Like rock stars, weren't they? Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. And then I remember it dawned on me on the journey up there, I'm like, I'm supposed to probably pitch them a game idea. And I hadn't actually thought about anything. So I had to just make something up on the spot, literally in the journey up there. And I came up with this idea called Celestial Garbage Collector, which was basically, like a Defender with trash. And I remember trying to pitch this to him, and I obviously hadn't practiced or anything. I just blurted out this sentence, waited for him to be like, wow, that's amazing. And he just kind of looked at me, and I could tell he just wasn't impressed at all.
Right.
And he was just like, well, why don't you just do a Commodore 64 version of Christian's game? He's the guy that I'd met. And he was making a Spectrum game called KGB Super Spy. So you can just do the Commodore 64 version of that. And I was just like, yes. A real contract to actually do something. And that was that, really. So I got that and, basically went home and programmed the Commodore 64 version of that, mostly laying on my front with my head looking up at the TV on the floor.
Oh, wow. Ergonomics weren't a thing often back then, were they?
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't have my own TV for the computer. It was like sharing the family TV. So
between Emmerdale and...
Well, and Neighbours was the thing I remember. My sister would come home and we always wanted to watch Neighbours.
Yeah, no one watched Emmerdale, Dad.
No,
just your mum.
Yeah, if I hear the music of that to this day, it makes me feel really depressed. There's something about it that just reminds me of rainy days and I can't
it's a bit melancholy. So that's awesome though. So KGB Super Spy, your first published game on the C64 from Codemasters. I mean, were you working much in the office then, or was it all kind of home based? I'm wondering kind of what the atmosphere was like at Codemasters during that era, because obviously they were flying really high then.
Yeah, well, no, I literally did all of the game from home. So the only time I got to see their office really was that initial meeting when we went up to where was it? I think it was like Banbury or something like this, I seem to remember. And they sort of had, I think it was like a bit of a sort of farm kind of setup, but the coders all seemed to be in these porter cabins. So the David Darling's office that I went to was basically literally a porter cabin. So I went in there and I was just sort of starstruck really from the fact that I was sitting in this room with David Darling. And I remember his dad came in at one point, Jim, I think his name was, something like that. And he was essentially, it's like David Darling felt like he was the boss. And I remember his dad came in and David sort of palmed him off with some orders or whatever. And then they let me have a quick little look around some of the other cabins. So I met a guy called Gavin Rayburn, I think his name was. He was doing a bunch of Commodore games. And that was the first time I'd ever really seen a room full of people with computers doing stuff together. And I just loved it. That was heaven for me. But yeah, that was literally all I got to see of that, really. Everything else was from home. And then I'd occasionally have these phone calls with my producer. What was his name? Mark Bulldog, I think, something like that. And yeah, I'd have to sort of, back then, again, no internet. So you'd have to you'd send in a copy of the game of where you'd got to.
In a jiffy bag.
In a jiffy bag, exactly. And then they'd get it and then they'd sort of do a little play test and find all the things that you hoped that no one would find, but that you knew were there, bugs and things. And actually a memory that stuck in my brain from that time actually was, because I'm still living at home with my mum, not earning any money at this point. The idea was that I'd get some money when the game was finished. My mum was starting to sort of nag me for rent and a bit of keep, because we weren't a wealthy family anyway. And I was like, when this game's finished, I'm going to get some money. So she's like, well, why can't I give you some money now? And I'm like, Mum, I've just got to finish the game. And I remember they'd phoned me up and I was speaking to this Mark Bulldog girl, I think it was, and she just came and ripped the phone off me and just started really giving it to this guy on the end of the phone, like, can't you send him some money? I've got to pay for his food, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, Mum, you're going to bloody ruin it for me. And they sent a check the next day, basically. They gave me an advance. So that was,
good on your mum.
Yeah, so good on her. But I remember at the time thinking, oh, this is it. They're just going to want me to go away now. So that was quite a funny moment. But
well, you worked on the educational series Fun School as well for Europress, and Fun School was massively popular. Like, you know, it performed really well, and it was quite high end. Like some of the interfaces on there and some of the graphics were really good for edutainment.
Yeah, I mean that was so how that kind of came about was after I'd done the Codemasters game. You know, I'd become good friends with Christian Pennicate, his name was, the guy that did the Spectrum version. And he put me in touch with the people from Europress, that's what it was. He says, look, you know, you can do these games, these mini games for this company. It's easy money. And I was like, yeah, great. Okay, I can do those. And I think the Atari ST and possibly Amiga versions already kind of existed. So it was literally a case of like do the conversions of these things onto the Commodore. And it was great because it was a real chance to sort of blast through and learn a bunch of, it was like my apprenticeship, if you like, of programming the Commodore 64 properly after the KGB Super Spy. And I remember thinking I'd really made it because I was getting paid like £150 per mini game. And there was like 6 mini games on a actual disc, I think. So I'm like, you know, it was taking me about 2 or 3 days to make a game. So I'm getting 150 quid every few days. And I was just like, man, I'm raking it in, you know. But that was only later that I discovered that the guy that had been doing the Spectrum versions was charging that per hour.
Oh, wow.
So he was obviously a much better businessman than me. And we actually ended up all sort of banding together. And that was the sort of first company that I was part of, really. We had this sort of cooperative. And we were all making, that started off with us all making the Fun School games.
It's mad when I look at it because the stats, it's saying, you know, 650,000 copies were sold of.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously they made a good profit on the Commodore 64 versions there for sure. But I was happy just to sort of have my foot in the door really at the time. And then by the time we sort of formed that company together, that, you know, we were charging them a bit proper money really. And I actually just moved into doing graphics then as well because I'd obviously had the art background, do graphics easily, and, you know, programming was a bit more of a headache. So that was nice and easy for me. I just did all the graphics for it eventually. And that was really nice. We ended up doing quite a lot of different stuff, actually, not just for Europress, but we did, we did another game for Europress called Lombard RAC Rally or something. It's like a sort of licensed 3D racing game. I remember I had to do lots of trees and things for that. And we had a scanner in the office and I scanned them all out of this book and just sort of touched them up. And towards the end of the project, they found out that I'd done that. So we had to go through every single tree, find it in the book, and then I had to change it so it didn't look like the one in the book, essentially. And we did some other stuff for like Ocean. We did Sleepwalker, which was like a sort of comic relief game. I did that.
Yeah, I remember that game. It was a pack-in on the Amiga, that game, I remember. You did the 64 version, is that right?
I did the graphics for it, yeah. And the programming was a guy called Chris Walsh, actually. He was brilliant.
And that had a lot of promo, like you said, with comic relief at the time and a lot of hype.
Yeah, exactly. That was probably the first time I felt like I was working on quite a high-profile game, really. And Hook we did for them as well. That was similar sort of prestige, I suppose. I think we had the NES version of it or something, I think, and we were sort of like using that as our guide. But yeah, I ended up doing quite a bit of stuff there, really. But eventually they went bust, essentially. Just, I suppose, as it was kind of moving more to 16-bit, didn't really handle the transition to that. So we ended up just sort of going bust, and then I was back to being at home. But obviously I'd got a little bit of a experience behind me by then. And I signed up with a recruitment agency and ended up getting an interview to go to Bullfrog.
I was going to ask that next. So tell us about first meeting Peter Molyneux then, and how did that lead you to joining Bullfrog?
Yeah, so what actually happened was I got an interview at a company called Bits Interactive, which was just down the road from Argonaut Software, I think, but it was in London. And I remember I got this interview, but I was skint at the time. I couldn't even afford the train fare or anything. And there was actually this scheme that the Conservative government, although I was like, you know, my stepdad was a hardcore socialist, so Tories were like Satan incarnate, really. But they actually had this scheme called Travel to Interview Scheme, where like if you got an interview somewhere in the country, they would buy you a ticket so you could go to it. And I took advantage of that, which I thought was really good because that was essential to my story, really. So I got this interview, went to Bits Interactive, got a job there, was there for about 3 days. And then I got a phone call from someone pretending to be my girlfriend that was actually a recruitment lady. And she said, look, I've got you an interview at this place called Bullfrog. It's much better than where you are now. Are you interested? And I was like, actually, I was, because my circumstances at the time were pretty chaotic, which I won't go into. But I was like, if I do that, that'll give me a chance to sort of sort my life out in Ipswich a little bit, and then I can go and work at Bullfrog. Although I'd never heard of them myself. But they said this was round about the time that they'd been doing Populous and all that kind of stuff. So they were becoming quite famous on the Amiga and that, weren't they? And so I went to this interview at Bullfrog. And I didn't actually meet Peter straight away. I actually met their head of art guy called Paul McLaughlin, Irish dude, really nice dude. And I remember, you know, I brought along a disc to sort of show him my portfolio, and annoyingly brought along the wrong disc. Instead of bringing all the pictures that I had saved on this 3.5-inch disc, 3.25-inch disc, whatever it is, I brought a pirate copy of D-Paint instead.
All right.
I basically picked up the wrong disc. Luckily, on the reverse side of it, there was like one picture that I'd saved or something. And Paul was just such a nice guy. He just gave me the job anyway, just based on my experience, I think. But I sort of almost felt guilty that he'd given me the job. So I remember going back about a week later with my actual portfolio. I'm like, look, I really can do graphics. Like, here's my stuff. And he was like, yeah, man, whatever, you know.
At least it wasn't a pirated version of a Bullfrog game.
Yeah, embarrassing. Yeah, exactly. So I got the job at Bullfrog, started there, and that was the first time I felt like I was at a real computer games company, if I'm honest, that, you know, I had a job and they gave me like a pension and I was getting a regular salary so I could commit to getting an apartment and all this kind of stuff. It was really exciting. And my first encounter with Peter, I think, was... So my first task when I got to Bullfrog, because they were just finishing up Theme Park on the PC, so there wasn't really much that needed doing, but I just did a font for them. I did this sort of bubbly font thing. And then Paul tasked me with doing all the SNES and Mega Drive graphics of the game. They were going to convert it to that. And so and that was literally just me doing it. And I remember really getting stuck into that because it was actually... I'd never done any Mega Drive stuff before, but it was kind of similar to the Commodore 64 in that it was sort of based on, character graphics, like 8x8 blocks, essentially. So I did this little mock animation, if you like, of the sort of theme park in full swing with all these little characters walking around in this style that I'd done. I put it together really quick, like 3 or 4 days or something. And I just remember Peter coming into the office and sort of walking past and seeing that on my monitor. He sort of pointed at it and laughed and thought, oh, that looks great. And I was like, oh, yes, I've managed to impress the boss. This is good stuff. That was kind of it, really. So I suppose that was probably the first time he noticed me. And Sale just did those graphics really quickly. And I did a pretty good job of that, I'd say, because it's one of these things where like the PC thing had been done, so I knew what the game was. And I had my Commodore 64 experience, so I could sort of tailor it towards something that suited those sort of size blocks and things. So it kind of gave it its own look that was obviously inspired by the PC version, but it was... I would argue it was almost felt like it was a little bit more together, if you know what I mean, consistent, whereas the PC one had a bunch of different artists on it.
Yeah, and it looked very console-y as well, and like the way the characters had changed and stuff. Did you kind of deliberately try to, if you're doing it for the Super Nintendo as well, kind of look at those systems and emulate that kind of style?
Yeah, kind of. But to be honest with you, especially back then, a lot of the style was dictated by the constraints of the machine, really.
The palettes and stuff like that.
There's the palettes, but also like I was just saying, how all of the graphics were made out of these little 8x8 tiles, sort of like Commodore 64 style character graphics. So the characters, for example, the little people that walked around, were literally like their head was one of those, and their body was another one. so that we could easily sort of mix and match the heads and the bodies and things. So it was more like their proportions were defined by the fact that they were made out of these 2 8x8 blocks. And a lot of the graphics as well, obviously you'd try and reuse the tiles to sort of save memory. And so that was really kind of what defined it. But yeah, in terms of having a sort of consistent, I made sure that everything had like a nice white highlight on it and all this kind of stuff. It made it sort of quite bright and cheery. So there was a conscious effort to make it its own thing. But yeah, no, it was more the constraints of the machine that defined it really.
And were there also like considerations, the fact that you weren't using a mouse as a controller with, stuff like the interface design?
Oh yeah, I mean, I wasn't involved with the programming at all. I was literally just doing the art, so I didn't really have to think about that. I was just like, I just want to make this look as pretty as possible, and I would mock up lots of animations for how the roller coaster would work and all this kind of stuff. And again, it was handy because the little people were made out of these 2 8x8 blocks. For the rides, it was easy. We just used the head on its own and would put those on the rides, and that sort of helped define all that really. But yeah, no, I didn't need to think about interface or design. I wasn't really. I was fully embraced I was in my artist mode at that point in time. So that was other people's problems to think about that stuff.
Because I played Theme Park on the Amiga, but looking at the list of platforms that it came out on, I didn't realise quite how many systems it was released on. It was everything from the 3DO to the Jaguar to the Sega Saturn as well. So there's quite a lot of platforms, I guess, you guys had to cover.
Yeah, that was. I think that was pretty much all handled in house as well, actually, as far as I remember. But yeah, I only worked on the Mega Drive and the SNES. That was essentially the same set of graphics for those, and it was just one other programmer that was doing it as well. So it was 2 people on each project there.
Well, in 1994, Bullfrog released one of their most ambitious titles to date, of course, the mighty Magic Carpet.
Oh yes.
So. Tell us a bit about your memories of that then. Where did the idea of that come from, and what was the initial kind of plan for it?
I think it was one of Peter's ideas. I'm assuming it was his initial idea, but the main programmer on it was a guy called Sean Cooper. So I'm sure he had, he was very instrumental in a lot of the ideas too. But and I'd say probably one of the biggest influences on that game was Glenn Corpez, really, and because he'd done he had the engine, essentially. He had this sort of like landscape that could kind of morph and you could fly over, and he had the sort of the fogging and all of that stuff going. And because polygons were quite a sort of novel thing at the time, they were only just sort of starting to really appear in games. And, he had textures on the polygons, which I think was quite revolutionary at the time. They weren't actually perspective ones, so you'd get this kind of weird warping or whatever. But, yeah, a lot of it came from that really, and the fact that you could morph the landscape. I guess a lot of the gameplay ideas came from that really, because you had to sort of grow the castles and they'd sort of pop out of the ground and all that kind of thing. But again, my involvement with that was just an artist really. I had the lead artist was a guy called Finn McGecky, mad Scottish tall dude who I love a lot actually. We used to pretend to hate each other. He was Scottish, I was English. There used to be a bit of rivalry there, but it was all tongue in cheek. But he was really the main artist on that. And I just did some palm trees and a giant crab, I seem to remember.
Right.
But I wasn't really involved in the actual game. They'd go off and sort of have some meetings and come back and go, yeah, right, we've decided we need a giant crab. Mark, that's yours. And I would just get to it. And I was obsessed with, like, Finn would draw everything by hand, essentially. He was like quite old school artist like that. Whereas I was, I'd been embracing 3D Studio, which was quite new at the time. So I loved this idea of I would sort of actually build things, render them with a camera, and then sort of draw over them as though they were things, so I could get all the rotations and that correct without having to think about it and that sort of stuff. But
at the time, the whole industry was moving 3D, wasn't it? So did you feel like you kind of had to make that change at that time and really embrace the 3D technology?
No, not really. I think probably on the game side, maybe that's what they were thinking. But on the graphics side, no, it was pure laziness from my point of view.
Right.
As in, I'm like, well, if I've got to do a crab and I need to do it at 8 different rotations, instead of sort of like, being skillful and working out what things look like at different rotations, I can just make it in 3D and literally render it. And then I can just sort of draw over it and it will have the lighting and the correct proportions and everything done for me. So no, it was pure laziness, I'd say.
I was talking to you before we started recording. I said that I played Magic Carpet again over the weekend, for the first time in quite a while. And I did notice, a few things in there that obviously were, technology of the time was, like you said, this whole 3D gaming. It was very new, polygons at the time. And there's quite a heavy use of fog in the game as well. I mean, was that just to kind of get the game running at a reasonable speed then? Were there kind of a lot of changes that happened to get it up to that frame rate that it needed to be?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Glenn would be the person to speak to there. But I mean, my perception of it was that it looked bloody cool,
Yeah.
But obviously it also sort of, because there was, you were limited to how many polygons you could draw on the screen. I think Magic Carpet was probably pushing like 1,000, possibly 2,000 polygons,
right,
or something. But so obviously you couldn't draw infinitely into the distance, so you'd have to just cut it off at some point. So the fogging was a nice way of hiding that cut off, because it would just gradually blend out and all look intentional. So obviously that had the double whammy of looking very cool, but also meant we could not have to worry about drawing all this distance stuff. Now, I remember the way the palettes worked was quite clever, because, again, I think you were limited to 256 colours at the time. And Glenn had this sort of system where you'd choose like a palette of colours, and then it would automatically work out all the fogged versions of them and squeeze them into 256 colours and things. So, there was a lot of quite clever stuff going on there. Glenn was he was the office genius at the time, I would argue. But Sean Cooper was just a force of nature. He'd do stuff so quickly. I really loved working with him, because you'd have an idea and he'd have it up and running in like half an hour or something. He was a complete machine. So, and he used to play it to death as well. I remember lots of us playing it in the office multiplayer all the time and testing it. Slightly annoyingly, I had a slower PC than everyone else though, because I was, a bit of a grunt artist at the time. Sean Cooper had this amazingly super smooth, silky thing, and mine was sort of like running at like 10 frames a second or something.
Chugging along.
What was the kind of expectation like there then? I can imagine everybody got on board, but also, this was new technology and you were kind of entering the 3D world. What was it like at the studio at the time? And was there kind of a pressure that this one had to deliver?
Quite possibly, but I was just all starry-eyed, and I was in this newfound heaven of like, well, there's people making games, and Theme Park was incredibly successful. I remember that. So I was under the impression that the studio had lots of money in the bank, so there wasn't really a worry about, didn't feel to me that there was a lot of pressure to come up with something quickly. Peter might tell a different story. Just felt very magical to me. I mean, I remember spending a lot of time learning to juggle, actually. Because I remember you'd come to the office and most people were walking around juggling, especially Glenn. And he actually, one of the first things I did at Bullfrog was learn how to juggle, and there was other people on unicycles and things. It was just a really kind of playful, very creative atmosphere, really.
You had to do something while those 3D graphics rendered, I suppose.
Well, yeah, exactly. Maybe that was while he was waiting for stuff to compile or something. But I remember he was very good. He could do the whole 4 balls and juggle with one hand and all this kind of stuff. So it felt like I had to sort of learn, really, to sort of be a part of the club, so to speak. But yeah, very fond memories, really. It was all like very magical, and felt like everything was going right at the time for Bullfrog. Theme Park was incredibly successful, and then Magic Carpet got a good reception, I seem to remember. I
remember the marketing was huge for it as well.
Was it really? Yeah.
Absolutely everywhere. Yeah.
I do remember seeing the game on Neighbours, funnily enough, the soap opera. It made an appearance on there somehow. And that, that was one of those things that gave me the impression that, like, well, Bullfrog really is the place to be. This is where it's all happening.
If Toadfish is playing,
that's what he's made it, Well, in 1997, Bullfrog released Dungeon Keeper.
Yes.
And I heard, you're heavily involved in that. You did the majority of the graphics and the character designs on it as well. So what memories have you got of working on Dungeon Keeper?
Yeah, well, so that was literally after Magic Carpet. I think I impressed them enough with what I was doing for Paul to give me the role of a lead artist. He's like, well, you can be lead artist on this Dungeon Keeper game. So obviously I was really excited. And I sort of teamed up with Simon Carter, it was at the time. And there's his brother, Dean Carter. Can't remember if he was there literally day one or if he came a little bit later, but it was essentially the Carter brothers. who obviously, later on went to do Fable and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And we were sort of left to our own devices really for quite a while. And Bullfrog was a bit like that because Peter would be off on other projects. And so it was just like we had a loose idea. It was like literally a sentence like, okay, it's a game where you're the dungeon master and you're having to fight off heroes that come in. So we spent a fair bit of time just working on the kind of the look of it really. And the engine was a modified version of the Magic Carpet engine that Glenn had done. Because the Magic Carpet engine was literally like a sort of height field with the points raising up, whereas Dungeon Keeper, you could have the actual proper blocks to make walls that were vertical and all this sort of stuff. So I just sort of got to town, went to task really of designing a bunch of creatures, and I had this plan of like, right, I'm going to, again, using 3D Studio, I'm going to model a human body with all the muscles, but without the skin. So I remember looking at lots of anatomy books and doing all the muscles and things. And then I sort of thought I could just reuse those and pull them about for different proportions to make all the creatures' bodies, essentially. You can get these really nice defined kind of muscles and things. So I spent a fair bit of time doing that. And then Simon was doing some cool lighting stuff. For quite a long time, it was just the sort of an engine that you could sort of roam around and shoot fireballs, and that would be really cool, watching a fireball go down a corridor. And I remember rendering literally everything in that, actually. All of the textures for the walls, even if it was just like a brick texture, I would build the bricks in 3D Studio and then render them so I could get like a nice sort of 3D looking version of them. And that worked really well in the game, because although it was a 2D texture, it kind of ended up looking a bit like a more complex 3D model than it really was. So yeah, for quite a long time we were just doing that really, but the actual game design itself was really, it wasn't one. It was a bit muddy. We were just sort of more focused on the making it look cool than anything else really. And then something happened. So I can't remember. I think Bullfrog had probably been bought by EA by then, and Peter was kind of not around very much. I think he was off. He'd been given the task of having to sort of be some executive within EA, which he absolutely hated. Something happened. Blah, 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 I don't know what, but essentially Peter got banned from the office.
Oh, wow.
Which sounds really odd, but I guess they decided that he was going to leave at this point or something. So he wasn't allowed to come into the office anymore, but Dungeon Keeper was just like a year, maybe 2 years into development or something. And I think he took it upon himself to sort of say, well, I'm going to finish this Dungeon Keeper game. So we actually, there's only literally about 3 or 4 of us, we moved to Peter's house essentially, and we worked from his house for the whole rest of the development. And it was only then that the design really happened, because Peter was fully on it. And he kind of went back to scratch really. He sort of did this like 2D little test bed from above that got the basics of the game working. And then we sort of imposed that onto this 3D engine that we had. And that's when the proper game development started happening, I suppose. But I was literally the only artist for a long time on that project, sitting at Peter's house. Paul McLaughlin ended up doing the very cool map kind of screen where you're looking through the window, but literally everything else I kind of did really. I think there was a guy called Darren Thomas, Welsh guy, who did some of the intro. Another friend of mine did like a samurai character or something like that. But yeah, I probably did about 90% of the graphics for that.
Well, the Horned Reaper as well, Horny, was interesting character. What was the inspiration for his design?
That, believe it or not, that was actually based on an old girlfriend of mine, who kind of had in my head anyway, that was what her smile looked like. And she sort of had a similar jawline. Obviously I exaggerated it and made a sort of caricature of her, but yeah, it was literally based on her. Rachel, her name was.
Did she know?
No. I had managed to upset her a long time ago, so she never talked to me for a long time.
Right.
She wasn't my girlfriend at the time; it was an ex-girlfriend, and yeah, it was one of those ones where I totally regretted what I did and tried to get back with her for a long time, but she wouldn't even talk to me and blah blah blah. So I guess she was an obsession in my head for a long time. That's probably why that happened.
She was immortalised in the game, though.
Yeah, exactly. But she probably doesn't know that. And then, yeah, that's quite funny. But so that. But also, I was looking through lots of like White Dwarf magazines, for example, looking at the various kind of creature all the sort of Warhammer type stuff and all that. That was kind of a big inspiration, I suppose.
Well, another iconic feature of Dungeon Keeper was the minion slapping mechanic, which obviously gave that quite a humorous element to the game. I heard you came up with that idea as well?
Yes. Yes, I can claim fame to that one. The actual idea of having a hand itself was Peter, I think. And we had the basic hand in there. And I would often sort of mock, because I think I used to use D-Paint a lot of the time, and you could sort of create animations in there, or Deluxe Animate, I think it was called. So I animated this whole thing, and I was just like, well, you've got a hand and creatures, she's got to be able to slap them. That's just felt obvious to me. I guess I'm just naturally evil or something. But and I just mocked up an animation of it doing that to sort of sell the idea. So yeah, that. And yeah, I designed all the creatures, and I think the favourite thing I designed for that was the grenade. There was a grenade that you could fire off that was also a creature that used to sort of like make this screaming sound. I remember that being funny. Because I was a big fan of Jim Henson and Creature Workshop stuff all the time. So I guess it was kind of inspired by that sort of mentality, really.
And the technology let you do that kind of thing by then as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, all the there were sprites in that game. They weren't proper 3D meshes or anything. They were just 2D sprites. But again, I rendered them all in 3D Studio. You know, I made the characters and animated them, and then I just had a sort of camera set up that would do the 8 different rotations I think we had, but then also 2 elevations.
So later that year, after Dungeon Keeper came out, you followed Peter to go and work with them at Lionhead Studios, which you'd founded by then. So tell us about that move, and why did you decide to leave Bullfrog at that stage?
So, yeah, I mean, obviously I worked with Peter a lot, and I was working at his house, so I almost became a little bit sort of disassociated with Bullfrog because of that, I would argue. And, you know, he went off to do Lionhead. I used to hang out with him socially as well. I just liked working with Peter. And Bullfrog had become a lot more corporate by that point. The sort of EA kind of Borg assimilation had sort of taken full effect by then. So it was just a natural move for me, really. It was just like, well, I'll just carry on working with Peter. So in some ways, it felt like I just carried on what I was doing, really. And again, that was really exciting, you know, because we were starting a new company. I was literally the first artist there. And we had this sort of choice of projects that we were going to do. And yeah, that was it, really. It was just really exciting. And at the time, there was a guy called Demis, who obviously horrendously famous now for DeepMind and Google AI and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But he was there at the start of the company. And I remember we had to decide what the project was going to be that we did. And there was sort of like 3 candidates. There was, you know, what became Black and White, which was kind of sold as Tamagotchi on steroids to me, which really excited me. And then there was this other game which Demis had come up with, which I think was called Legacy or something like this. It was a sort of more of a kind of businessy type epic strategy game or something. And then something else that I forget. And we sort of voted on it. And we voted on the Tamagotchi on steroids game, which I think probably upset Demis at the time. So he left about a month later, I think, went off to do his stuff. But yeah, we got stuck into Tamagotchi on steroids, essentially. And that was really exciting. It was like, oh, we can use slapping again. You know, if you've got a pet creature, you've got to be able to slap it, surely.
I was kind of wondering how much influence from Dungeon Keeper went into that. And it kind of, to me, graphically, it kind of felt like the opposite to Dungeon Keeper. You know, it was quite light and bright.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well, I mean, so although I was the first artist at Lionhead and I did some of the initial sort of concepts, Paul McLaughlin, who was the head artist from Bullfrog, he actually came to join Lionhead not too long afterwards. And he was the natural leader, really. So he had a big influence on that, really. So I'd say that a lot of that was down to him, really. But I ended up doing the ape. I did like an ape creature, for example. And I did the 2 characters that are like your conscience, the sort of evil dude and the good guy on a cloud or whatever. I remember really getting into those, and I sort of thought I could do a really good job of this. And I suppose you could argue there was a Dungeon Keeper influence there, because the bad dude was kind of like inspired by the Bile Demon from Dungeon Keeper, but a sort of cute version of that. And then the good guy, I actually just ripped that off from, do you remember the Asterix comics
Oh, I loved Asterix.
Yeah, so there was the druid, get a fix.
Get a fix, yeah.
Yeah, it was literally kind of based on him, really. I just sort of thought, I'll take him and put him on a cloud. That looks about right to me. So, yeah, that was that, really. And I got, stuck into various things on that, throw ideas in, but it was mainly the ape, and I did a bit of animation, etc., etc.
Outside of Lionheart, you were making games of your own by this stage as well. I know you did Ragdoll Kung Fu as well. So what was kind of the story there? Was that kind of working on extracurricular on an evening then? How did that kind of work?
So that was a little bit later than what would happen. So I think we'd finished Black and White, and I think there was a team working on Black and White 2, and I was on this other project, which was a sort of just a loose idea at the time. I think it was called Dimitri or something at the time. And no one really knew what it was. We'd just been sort of said, we're going to do this new game, and it's kind of going to be based in a big town or something. And that was all we knew about it. And again, Peter was sort of distracted doing other things. So we were just sort of left to our own devices, really. And I got it into my head that, like, okay, if it's going to be a town, let's simulate a whole town. Let's have a whole town where people have got jobs that they go to, and, they go and do all their tasks and things. And I remember the programmers at the time saying, no, that's way too hard. We can't do that. That too much computing power or something. And I was just like, what are you talking about? I could do that on a Commodore 64. It's just smoke and mirrors stuff, really. And it annoyed me so much that I was like, right, I'm going to learn to program again, because I hadn't programmed since the Commodore 64 days, really, in machine code. And I was like, right, what does everyone use now? C++. So I'm going to learn C++, just so I can write a demo of this idea to show them what I'm talking about. So that's exactly what I did. I made this kind of really simple little 2D city simulator with little faces that would go around and do their jobs and all that kind of stuff. And that gave me the programming bug again, really. So I was like, okay, well, they still don't like the idea, but at least I can program again now. So I took it upon myself to do a little fighting game. I thought that would be good practice. I'll make like a Street Fighter type game or something. So I started doing that, and completely separate from that, randomly, just because I was quite into Kung Fu, I decided to make a Kung Fu film one weekend with my friends. There was a video camera at the Lionhead office. Thought we can steal that for the weekend. Spent like £50 on some stupid costumes, like, bald wigs and plastic nunchuckers and things. No plan, no script or anything. It's just like, right, let's just go into the park and just film a load of stupid stuff and make up a Kung Fu film for a laugh. Kind of did that. Something in my head was like, oh, I can just use that as cutscenes in my silly little game that I'm doing. So that's how that sort of came about.
Oh, wow.
But for a long while, it was just like a sort of very sprite-based sort of Street Fighter type game, really. And a guy called Alex Evans, who I later went and founded Media Molecule with. I do a lot of stuff with him. We were sort of quite good friends. And he was interested in what I was doing. And he says, you should put rope swings in there. Because I had some basic platforms you could jump on. He says, why don't you put some rope swings in? And he gave me this little bit of code that would do like sort of rope physics, so I could do an actual proper little swinging rope. And I remember going home for the weekend and sort of coding that in. And the first thing I did was I had this bit of rope that was attached to my mouse, and I could drop it on the floor. And it's a rope that's made out of segments, you've got to imagine. So it's not like infinite curves. It's just sort of actually like a bunch of connected rods, really. And I sort of dropped it on the floor, and it just happened to fall in something that looked a bit like a stickman shape. And that I was just like, hold on, I could make the characters out of this rope physics. That'd be amazing. Because then they'd have all these like physical type movements, and I wouldn't even have to animate them. You could literally just sort of, grab the bits of rope to move these ragdolls around, essentially. And that felt like a real sort of little eureka moment for me. I got genuinely excited. I was like, that should be quite a fresh idea for a game. So I just, did that basically. It became that. Then randomly, someone posted a video of it on the Lionhead website or something at the time. And I got into quite a bit of trouble for that because lots of people sort of suddenly thought that was going to be a next Bullfrog game or something. I was like, shit, right. No, that's just my personal project. But luckily someone saw that, a guy called Jonathan Blow, who used to run a thing called the Experimental Games Workshop at GDC. So he wrote to me and invited me to GDC. I didn't even know what that was at the time. I'd never been before. To show my game in the Experimental Games Workshop. So I was like, awesome. Okay, I'm going to go to GDC. It's the first time I'd ever been to America. So I rocked up there thinking it was going to be like a small room with like 10 people in it or something, and we just sort of show each other our crazy little ideas. So I didn't actually plan like a presentation or anything. I remember turning up and seeing the room, and there was about 200 or 300 people. So
this is a bigger deal than I thought.
This is a bigger deal than I thought, but I just sort of winged it. You know, I went up and just sort of showed the game and sort of just made it up as I went along what I was talking about, really. But it really got lots of people laughing, and ended up becoming quite a sort of hit, if you like, of the show. And in that audience were some people from Valve, and they approached me afterwards, and they're like, "Oh, we've got this thing called Steam, and we're going to start putting third-party games on there. We'd love you to be the first game. Are you interested?" And again, I always lived in a bit of a bubble. Didn't really know what Steam was or who Valve were or anything like this. And Alex was with me at the time, and he says, "Dude, you've got to go, man. Go and speak to him. That's like Gabe Newell. He's one of the original dudes from Microsoft. He's big news." So I was like, "Yeah, cool, okay." So I got on a plane to Seattle the next day, went up to meet people at Valve, and they gave me a contract. They said,
"Oh wow,
yeah." I think they gave me $10,000 or something as an advance, and I was like, "Bloody hell, that's more money than I've ever had in my life in one go." Then I, a bit scared, because I was like, "That means I've actually got to finish this thing and turn it into a full-fledged game." But yeah, I managed to do it, and and that became the first third-party game on Steam, actually, which was quite a little. And there's God knows how many games are on there now. Must be tens of thousands, I imagine. But
I mean, let's talk about Media Molecule as well, because, I mean, your connections obviously just, you kept making these great connections, including with Sony as well, because you actually presented them an early demo of Little Big Planet. So tell us about the idea for Little Big Planet. Where did that come from then? And what memories have you got of that time?
Yeah, well, so that was a kind of, in my head, it was a progression of Ragdoll Kung Fu in some ways, in that, so I'd finished Ragdoll Kung Fu, which kind of gave me a little bit of a glimpse into the wider aspect of making a computer game. I wasn't just an artist now. I was obviously coding it, but also, I had to deal with localization, and I was talking to Valve, the publishers. So I got a bit of a sort of a crash course, if you like, in the sort of full suite of what it takes to make a computer game and get it out into market. And I remember at the time I was still at Lionhead, and they were going through lots of mad changes. I think they were about to float on the stock market or something. There was lots of weird shenanigans going on. And basically Alex and Dave, and Kareem, who I'd been working with in a room at Lionhead, had sort of decided they wanted to leave, really. And Alex was quite pushy about it, and I was a bit undecided. I was like, I quite like my job here, really. It's quite cushy. I get paid well, and I don't have to work too hard. I'm going to go away on holiday and think about it. And I came back, and Alex had basically handed my notice in for me, which sounds weird, but that was kind of like, "Okay, go, dude, we're out of here." And I was like, "Oh, okay, great." And we've got an interview. We've got a meeting with Phil Harrison next week, who we'd got through a friend of a friend, Pete Hawley. He'd got us that. We're going to go and meet Phil, and we're going to pitch a game. So we better work out something to pitch, basically. So, from Ragdoll Kung Fu, the influence there, if you like, was the fact that you could design your own characters. People could sort of draw their own characters and put them in the game.
Yeah.
So there was this sense of like, well, people, and that was really popular within Ragdoll Kung Fu. So there was this sense of like, okay, something to do with user-generated content is an important part of this thing that we're going to pitch. And also the way that you could sort of perform with the characters, they're like puppets. That's kind of cool. But on a mouse, that was really clunky and actually a bit hard. If we're going to do a console game, we need the sort of like the DualShock, or whatever it was called at the time, the 6-axis controller or something, I think. We need the equivalent of being able to do that kind of stuff, but more console friendly. So these were the kind of like the ideas. And then Dave Smith, he already had this like amazing physics engine that he was working on in his own time, which didn't have a character in it or anything. It was just, you could just make literally thousands of 2D shapes, and they would all just collapse and settle really nicely. And it's amazing. So it's like, let's use that somehow, but let's get a character in there that you can sort of perform with and stuff. And we went to watch Howl's Moving Castle, I seem to remember, which is a film that had come out at the time, Studio Ghibli thing, as a sort of, we thought that might be inspirational in some way. And we loved all the imagery in that. There was lots of like sort of gems and just lots of things. It was a very sort of rich, complex looking stuff. So that kind of fed into it a little bit. And basically Dave went away and made this demo with his 2D thing and put a character in there, and it was called the Yellowhead demo.
Right.
This cool little sort of 2D character with little stick arms that you could run around and grab objects, and that was the sort of demo that we went to the Phil Harrison meeting with. Basically, we injected we made it look a bit prettier, we made it look like it was on a bit of paper or something, and we were adamant that we weren't going to take a PowerPoint presentation, because we know that he must see millions of those and he probably hates them. So we did the whole presentation in this little sort of 2D game demo essentially, and he was suitably impressed. Also we sold the fact that we just done Ragdoll Kung Fu, so we know what we're doing, we know how to make games. Give us a chance, just give us some money for 6 months and we'll turn this demo into something that hopefully you'll fully fund. So I think they gave us like a couple of $100,000 or something to go off for 6 months and make a demo, and that became Little Big Planet essentially.
Well, obviously, Little Big Planet went on to be a massive franchise. And I did read a couple of years ago that actually you kind of went back to roots and you were doing a version of Little Big Planet for the Commodore 64. What was kind of the deal there?
Yeah, that was, I think I discovered this thing on the PC that was like a really cool development suite, if you like, for making Commodore 64 games, but on a PC. Because it was a real pain in the ass back in the day. You couldn't have the graphics and the code in memory at the same time. You'd have to compile it. And so this idea that I could have stuff on a PC and just really nicely program it. And I wanted to experience that and almost pretend that I was back in time and I had that back then, and it would make life a lot easier. And it was just like, I'll have a go at doing a sort of little Sackboy inspired kind of thing. I started off just by drawing some sprites, I think, and that sort of slowly became more and more of a thing. It was quite a while ago that I started that actually, and I haven't finished it and I haven't actually touched it for a little while, but I do intend to kind of at least wrap that up into some sort of little demo that I could share with people. But I was sort of, at one point I was doing quite a little bit on that because it was my sort of escape, if you like. It's like a time machine, it's like I could crank that up, put on some 80s music and just feel like I was back in the day on my Commodore 64, but with the ultimate development tool. It was really loved that.
Well, fingers crossed you do get around to getting some time to finish that, Mark. It would be amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I should do, because I actually put quite a bit of effort into it. So it'd be a bit annoying to not share that.
We'll keep an eye out for that, and if you do, we'll share it in the news.
Awesome.
Just one quick question then, Mark. I mean, what are you up to these days? I know you're still involved in the games industry.
Yeah. So I stayed at Media Molecule for 17 years, I think it was, and I left last year. Finally, I sort of got to a point in my life where it was like, don't really like the sort of corporate life that had sort of become, really. And I just want to kind of do whatever I feel like, really. So I sort of decided I was going to go off and become an indie developer again, essentially. And that way I can just do whatever, can make up a game and not have to worry about whether it hits the right demographic and all that sort of stuff. I can be my own audience, if you like. So I've been slowly working on a personal project, essentially. That's a very left field, wacky indie game. But I'm also doing some freelance work to sort of bring in a little bit of money, which is great because it's forcing me to learn a bunch of stuff that I need to learn, sort of Unity and Blender and all these, getting my hands really dirty, doing all that stuff again. So, there's the freelance stuff that I'm doing for a project, which is looking really cool. I shouldn't really talk about that because I haven't asked permission, but that's looking really cool. And then I sort of mix my time between doing that and then my own little personal project, which I'm looking forward to unveiling at some point. But it's quite early days on that. I'm sort of still experimenting a lot. I've kind of got a rough idea of what I want to do with it. And it is actually inspired by a really old Atari 2600 game, which I won't mention because that'll give away the idea. But it's kind of like a modern take on that game. And the actual game itself is not amazing, but the title of it is brilliant. And I'm just like, would make a fantastic game these days. So that's what I'm doing.
Oh, well, Mark, it's amazing to hear that the passion still burns strong. Yeah,
I still love it. Still got that same sort of, childish excitement that I had back in the day, really. I just love making stuff on the computer. Love it.
Well, listen, thank you so much for reminiscing with us this week. It's been amazing to hear some of your stories, and we look forward to seeing your new projects when they come out.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time, and thanks for letting me indulge in the past.